Let's get to our panel now. With us from Dallas is Merrill Matthews. He's a resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation. Also joining us from Beijing is Peter Ho. He is an economist and a research fellow at the London School of Economics. And with me here in the studio is Sourabh Gupta. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. I want to welcome all of you to the show. And why don't we start with you, Peter? We're just a few days into this trade war, and the U.S. seems to be digging in. I want to play for you a little bit of sound from U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham from this weekend. Let's listen.
We got more bullets than they do when it comes to trade. We sell them $100 billion. They sell us $500 billion. We can hurt them more than they'll hurt us. And all we're looking for is for them to stop cheating when it comes to trade.
So I want to get to what China's view is on all of this. Some pretty tough words there from a U.S. Senator who's backing Donald Trump and his actions.
Well, China's view on this is pretty clear. China has expressed very clearly that this is a trade war that it has not opted for. And even last week, there was a report in the state media that said that this war could be likened to the invasion of Japan in China during the Second World War. At the same time, and that's interesting to see, is that China has emphasized that during the trade war it will stick to international law and international rules. And this is, of course, a message to the United States as well as to the international community that within a context where the United States seems to be pulling out of a lot of global and multilateral agreements, that China will stick to these agreements and will stick to international law and regulations.
Peter, that's a good point. Let me move on to Merrill now, if I may, because there are concerns being raised in farm states. You heard Jessica talking about kind of this laser-like focus on states in the Midwest with soybeans. And one of those governors, the governor of Arkansas, Republican Asa Hutchinson, said he hopes that we can bring an end to this trade war because it's going to hurt a lot of Americans, is the way he puts it. And, you know, when you look at the statistics, Citigroup research showing that so-called red states have over 50% more jobs, 3.9 million, in fact, linked to foreign trade than blue states. This is basically Trump territory. How are they going to react to this?
Well, they're reacting cautiously. I have heard a number of stories. The media is filled with stories of interviewing farmers and others in those red states who are being hit by the tariffs. They respond somewhat cautiously, somewhat guardedly, saying, you know, this is costing us right now. We can hold on for a little while. We support the president trying to address these issues, but it's very clear that it's hurting them significantly financially. And I think the real concern is what happens if this goes on for 2, 3, 4 months into next year. A lot of them feel like it's going to really hit them in the pocketbook.
How likely do you think that is?
You know, it's hard to say in this situation. I mean, I have to say China looks like the reasonable player in this. President Trump keeps coming back with threats to impose more. China says, let's make a concession here, make a concession there. We're hearing that in our media, and we just don't know where this is going. A month ago, we were hearing that progress was being made. Talks were going on. We thought we were going to be making some progress, but lately it's been mostly saber rattling, and so it's hard from an American standpoint to tell exactly where we are right now.
This unilateralism, this protectionism is not going over well, not just in China, but also in Europe. And that's interesting because they're being hit with U.S. tariffs as well. And the Chinese premier, Li Keqiang, is there this week, met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and he strongly committed China to free trade. Let's have a listen.
As you may have noticed, China is strongly seeking to open up commercially. This, of course, ensures us to have a stable economic development, but serves to combat a growing protectionist trade force.
So, Peter, let me get your sense of things out there on the world stage. China continuing to move towards globalization, embracing it, where the United States retreating.
Well, for China, this is, of course, something that is of great importance and that will have great effect on China as well. what you have to see is that in this whole trade war, things are completely simplified. And what we tend to forget is how intertwined the Chinese economy is with the American economy. So it is very important actually to see the complexity of the issue rather than simplifying it and saying that this trade war can sort of bring back jobs in the Rust Belt states in America, for example. It's much, much more complicated than this. And what you will see is as this trade war develops over time, it will get increasingly more difficult to assess what the exact impact will be as different states are more and more drawn into this.
Peter makes a good point. Sourabh Gupta, I want to enter you into this conversation. 30% solar tariffs imposed in January. The Solar Energy Industry Association tracking the numbers. It's cost 8,000 jobs so far. Construction jobs, they say 23,000 jobs will be lost this year alone. Trade partnership worldwide looking at steel and aluminum tariffs. They estimate 16 jobs will be lost for every steel or aluminum producing job that is gained in the United States. That would result in 400,000 jobs lost. Talk to me about what this is going to do to the U.S. economy, but then broaden it out. Talk to us about the global economy. What are the ripple effects?
The U.S., of course, is going to be hurt, as well as China is going to be hurt because they are, as Peter just mentioned, so intertwined economically. Of course, a lot of this pain, as you had mentioned, will be in the farm states and in states which have energy products to sell in China. For the world as such, initially, it is for some countries an opportunity to sell to China the products which the U.S. cannot sell to China. But every country knows that there's really nothing opportune about this moment right now. If the longer this goes on, everybody is going to be hurt. The most damaging fact which I feel coming out of this is that Mr. Trump has knowingly gone ahead and taken action which he knows does not comport with international law, and he does not agree with the very simple, basic building block principle of most favored nation. If that principle is not upheld, it all boils down at the end of the day to unilateralism. And the more unilateralism we have, the worse it's going to be. And I think countries are aware of that.
Merrill, it looked like you were going to say something.
Let me weigh in on that real quick.
Yes.
Yes, for most countries, it's just the issue of the tariff. Between U.S. and China, there's another issue, and that is the intellectual property issue. U.S. businesses have been complaining for some time that Chinese companies, if they're going into a merger or some type of partnership, demand a tech transfer over there or steal intellectual property and so forth. I've seen these complaints for a while, enough to make me think that there's some validity to it. So it's not just the tariffs between the U.S. and China, it's intellectual property. And if we address the intellectual property, it might be that President Trump would be willing to back off on some of the tariff fight, but we just don't know.
Well, let me ask you about that, because it doesn't seem clear what the objective is of this administration. Because at one point it's we want you to do this, and then it's we want you to do this, then China comes to the table and says, okay, we'll do this, but then the goalposts keep moving.
Yes, he oftentimes conflates the intellectual property with the tariffs. China has higher tariffs than the U.S. Based upon World Trade Organization estimates, but even that could be addressed. Why the president doesn't bring the intellectual property issues up more, you'll hear him mention it every now and then, but I believe they don't feel like they've made any real progress on that. You know, ZTE, I believe it was a company, that became an issue. The Congress tried to weigh in on that. And China was willing to, I think, change the board of the company, or the board was changed in order to try to address some of those problems. So once again, China looks like it's the reasonable player here, but it's going to be a challenge for us if we don't get those intellectual property issues addressed.
It's interesting. This is an issue that was brought up a lot, but I want to kind of piggyback off what Sourabh Gupta has talked about, which is violations of the WTO. I mean, that's what we're seeing here. And Matt Gold, who's a law professor at Fordham University, he's also a former deputy assistant U.S. trade representative, says it's as simple as a guy going into a car dealership and saying, hey, either lower your price by $2,000 or I'm walking out and buying from the guy down the street. He goes, or it's a guy walking in and saying, lower the price by $2,000 or I'm going to break your legs with a baseball bat. One is negotiation, the other is extortion. And he's making the case that that's how Trump is playing this game.
Oh, I think that's right. There's a decades-old law in the U.S. that allows the president to impose tariffs for national security concerns. So when he started imposing the tariffs on steel and aluminum, he said, well, okay, I can kind of see that. But then he threatened to impose tariffs on cars for national security concerns. Nobody thinks you have a national security interest in driving a Ford versus a BMW or a Nissan. It's just that just gets bizarre.
Peter, let me ask you about this intellectual property issue, because it's one that the Trump administration keeps going to. It's something that's thrown out there periodically. I want to get your take there in China.
Well, intellectual property rights is an issue that has been also in China. It has been an issue for a long time, and the Chinese government has been very concerned of trying to tackle it, because it's not something that also affects international companies, but it affects Chinese companies here as well. So it's something that the central authorities and local authorities are very concerned about, and also trying to take measures against. At the same time, we also have to realize that economic reforms and intellectual property right reforms is a part of that. These take a very, very long time to take hold, because China is not just a small country or something. It's an enormous country, meaning that the structural reforms that are needed that will take a long time as well to take effect. And what China has been doing over the past 10, 20 or 30 years or so is gradually trying to change its export-oriented economy towards a more domestic, consumption-oriented economy, which in the end will also benefit the United States, because American companies will be able to export more to China, benefiting from a rising middle class here in China. But again, that's something that will take a lot of time. What you will see right now in China is that there are still around 400 million people living in the countryside who are still in relative poverty, who are devoid from any kind of social security. And that means that these people are still very much sitting on their savings. So it is difficult for them to start consuming. And that's something that needs to be tackled also. And again, that will take time.
Yeah, it'll take time. I'll tell you what, we're going to take a short break. Much more on the trade war between the United States and China. And when we come back, please stay with us.